Happy New Year, everyone. It's a new year. I've got two new cars that I've been working on to show you today. Let's get into it. First off, if you're new to the channel, welcome. My name's Mitch. I'm one of the owners here at Rolland Garage. We are an indoor P-tile track and shop here in Sacramento, California that specializes in Japanese style 1/10 scale rear wheel drive RC drifting. If you've been watching me on our channel already, I want to thank you for all the support the past few years I've been doing these videos for our shop. If I have helped you through these videos or on Facebook, as I'm often on there commenting on help posts in the RC drift groups, consider supporting us by checking out our online store at www.rollandgaragerc.com for your next RC drift purchase, or through some of my Mitch-Spec stickers also on our website. We currently ship to all 50 US states, as well as Puerto Rico and Guam. On to the topic of this video. If you've been watching the channel for a while, you might have seen some of my past cars from MC1 to YD2S to the TDP. In August of last year, I brought my TDP down to GGT in Garden Grove, California for Rêve D's first US appearance at the Rêve D USA party. I had a blast at the event, but after, I was convinced to try out something new. I decided to turn the RDX from my RD 2.0 versus RDX video into my personal car. I've been tuning this car since September 1st of last year, and it's been through several stages with various parts and tuning, but so far it's feeling pretty dialed as a replacement to my TDP. I'm going to go over the whole car, go over some specs, and give you a look at maybe one of my best cars yet. Everyone who watched my RD 2.0 versus RDX video knows where this car started. Going into this based off what I found in that video, I knew the out-of-the-box setup wasn't really what I wanted to leave this car at. Being a car that I would use every day as my top performer, I knew I had to throw some hop-up parts at it and make it my own. Using suspension parts mostly from the TDP, I was able to convert this RDX to about 90% upgraded. I'm currently using the high motor rear servo layout. I'm using the Rêve D FRP V2 chassis with the included side rails, and I got this upper deck from Vincent from D-Style. Shout out to him for hooking me up with that so I can get even more rigidity in this chassis. I think it's from Wrap Up Next, and it just screws into the top plate holder using the small top deck piece. I gave up all my Futaba Acuvance stuff on this car to run Rêve D's full lineup of electronics. Right now I have the standard RSST while I wait for the RSST Pro to ship to me with this new top-line DX noise canceller device. This device is supposed to suppress some hunting, and it was cheap enough for me to want to try it, so here it is. Revox gyro, Absolute 113.5 turn, and Brev ESC with a Blaze capacitor off my old ESC. I tend to like to upgrade to bigger capacitors over stock for a bit more available turbo punch and for an added torque feeling in the throttle. It was a bit of a change going from being able to tune everything on the fly and being able to monitor battery voltage and temps on my remote to pretty much not being able to do any of that conveniently, but it's not so bad now since I have everything about where I need it tuned to. All the ESC settings I can access on my phone, although I usually need to pull my car off the track to do so, and I'll usually just play with the gyro gain and the curve on the Revox. If I feel I need more response out of the gyro, I'll bump the curve down but turn the gyro up a bit. If it's a little too snappy and I'm spinning, I'll turn the curve up but turn the gain down to try to stabilize the car while keeping initiations and transitions quick. On the front end, I've actually swapped everything to primarily Yokomo style parts. I'm using the Rêve D HG front conversion, which allows for more caster adjustment than the regular RDX upper arms, and a carbon front shock tower with a more traditional shock mounting position. In order to use these arms, I've swapped to a Yokomo front bulkhead. However, on this Rêve D chassis plate, there's no holes for this bulkhead, so there's a bit of room for the whole front end to flex under droop, but I don't think it's a huge deal breaker in order to run this setup. It is possible to use this conversion on the RDX front without the carbon shock tower, but there's quite a bit of flex in the RDX shock tower, so I opted for the Yokomo bulkhead instead. I moved the Rêve D ASL lower arms and suspension mounts over from the TDP, and this stuff will go right on any RDX without modification. Just get the Rêve D 3x42mm suspension pin to replace the stepped RDX pin and suspension mount balls that usually go on the rear arms. I had the goal of running the RDX inline servo layout, but I needed to use the SG bell crank in order to use the YD2 geometry ASL front knuckles off the TDP. So what I did was use the center link from the SG bell crank and screwed it into the RDX wiper arms. One day I'll probably convert to the aluminum arms, but this will do for now. The rear is pretty standard RDX components. I swapped the spool for a Yokomo ball diff.
I run it pretty tight right now, but I'm looking for a bit more corner exit speed, so I may try opening it up a bit. I'm also running Rêve D's 45mm HT arms, aluminum hubs, and their new sway bar. I'm not sure if I can feel much benefit of the sway bar yet, but the car feels like it has a good amount of grip, and I used Rêve D's high auto setup video on YouTube to make sure everything is set right. I might try the optional thicker sway bar soon. I did swap the rear shock mounting to the wrap-up neck shock adapter for the more traditional shock mounting like I have in the front. I got these from one of my team drivers, Tyler. Thanks, Tyler. I'm using a 64 pitch, 36 tooth pinion, and 110 tooth spur for a final drive ratio of 7.94. I use the stock RDX springs since they're close to the R-Tune springs I would have put on anyways, on an HRC nerd setup on some Tamiya TRF shock bodies. I tend to run my dampening a bit higher than most for a P-tile, like here at Rolland Garage. I feel like I get a bit more on-throttle grip like this. The nerds are useful in allowing me to experiment with different dampening levels without doing a full rebuild with different weight oils. I have ran super soft shocks before and it's smooth, but it just feels like the car dumps all the grip through the shocks as you get on the throttle. It can depend on chassis setup and track surface though. Super soft seems to work much better for harder surfaces like polished concrete. Right before Christmas 2024, I decided I wanted to challenge myself and take up a new project. The MST RMX usually gets a bad rap in the RC drift community, probably because most people think of the ready to run when they hear RMX. So I got a good deal on the slightly dated 2.5 RS and took it upon myself to make it as competitively driving as possible. For electronics, I already had a spare Yokomo DX1 Type R 13.5 turn with a titanium rotor, so I used that and then picked up a brand new matching Yokomo BL Pro 4 ESC to pair with it, which is actually the first ESC I started this hobby with, so I was already familiar with tuning it. After moving to Rêve D Electronics on the RDX, I had the Futaba CD700 left over, so I had a servo. For gyro, I had a couple GYD 550 sitting around, but I again decided to challenge myself while still providing some tuning convenience, and got a GYD 470. The odd thing about this gyro is that you can only set the endpoints with an equal travel left to right, which is why I think a lot of people don't use the GYD 450 and 470. The good thing about it is, by using the R334 SBS receiver on this car, I can still wirelessly tune my CD700, even though I don't have access to all the same gyro settings as the 550, so this is useful in getting the gyro servo feeling right, and getting the endpoints set up right without stressing the servo. I already previewed this chassis a bit in a YouTube short. The chassis parts remain pretty much stock aside from this updated aluminum bell crank, and although it doesn't have a forward tilt like most of the other manufacturers are opting for, the reposition mounting makes it a bit easier to adjust the Ackerman. I did play with making the steering equal at mid-lock, but this car tended to crab walk a bit at mid-angle when I gave it throttle, so once I opened it up a bit, that went away. I did modify the stock front knuckles slightly. The extended steering arm tends to hit the lower arms at droop, so I trimmed them a bit. The rear is where this car gets interesting compared to a stock layout RMX. In an attempt to get more rear bias that's common to more competitively used chassis right now, I decided I wanted to try to move some components further back. I started with the battery. This requires the aluminum upper deck connector or cutting the plastic one, which was easy enough for me, and drilling new holes in the chassis, which was pretty nerve-wracking getting the positioning right and trying to countersink the holes on the bottom without the proper tools. So I wouldn't recommend doing this unless you're confident in being able to measure and drill everything properly. Even I wasn't able to countersink the holes perfectly, but it was good enough for me to run the car without any issues. By moving the battery back, I would run into issues with the spur clearing my battery. This led me to running a 100 tooth 64 pitch spur, which runs pretty small and required a pretty big 43 tooth pinion to mesh, giving an FDR of 6.97. Probably a bit lower than I'd like, but I tuned the ESC around this setup, so it's not really a problem for me. I also moved the servo back in the same fashion, getting even more weight back. I wasn't comfortable trying to countersink this slot on the bottom because I would probably mess it up, so I just decided to run a button head screw instead. Overall, I was able to push the battery back 41mm and the servo back 44.5mm. And you might have noticed all the weights on the car. Probably could weight it up with some more upgrade parts, just don't want to spend more money on this car. And this way I get to put the extra weight right where I want it. The aluminum heatsink motor plate allowed for the motor to be moved further back than the factory one, but it doesn't allow for proper meshing with the stock 2280 gearing if you were planning on getting one, so you'll have to re-gear your pinion and spur. Looking at the RMX KMW 3.0, which was the highest grade RMX that's been produced so far, pretty much full option. I found a layout that was pretty similar to the idea I was going for on this car, so I was happy to find that. They don't really offer any chassis with this exact layout anymore. The newer RMX EX is similar, but the servo is further up, and being on the same lightweight flexible carbon chassis plate as my 2.5 RS would require the same modification to the battery holder and servo mounting holes. The shock setup on the RMX is pretty similar to the RDX. I used another set of nerd dampers on some top line +1mm bodies. These ones feature the HRC compression caps, which allow me to adjust shock length separate from the spring preload, kind of like the MST TDA shocks. I'm using Rêve D R-tuned soft springs in the front, which are pretty hard still, and their hardest R-tuned PC spring in the rear. Dampening is set similar to the RDX. In conclusion, obviously I felt the RD 2.0 was a better car out of the box than the RDX. However, a comment left by this user was pretty valid. We've seen a multitude of new and innovative upgrade parts already being released for the RDX, but not much outside of some carbon fiber and aluminum adaptations of the stock parts for the RD 2.0. Rêve D really does have a much longer term plan for this car, being their first chassis design from the ground up. I think even with the time I have in this hobby as a driver and a tuner, I feel like this is a car I can grow into with new and fresh parts and find ways to use my knowledge to increase the potential and performance of my car and my driving. I'm glad I took on the challenge of trying out the 2.5 RS in an attempt to change the narrative on the RMX. I think with a little more work, this car will keep up even more than it already does with the rest of the pack. I just have way less time tuning and driving it compared to the RDX, so with time, I'm confident it'll only get better. I'm gonna throw some setting sheets up on the screen I made for these two cars. Hopefully you can find some use in them.
These are my two main cars. Hope you guys enjoyed taking a look at them today. I'm constantly tuning and tweaking things, trying to make my car and driving better, so things will probably change right after this video. It was even tough trying to keep things the same long enough to make this video. Until the next one.
I also have one of these. I think I'm just going to keep this as a for fun car. And look what came in just in time for the end of this video. Maybe a video on this soon? And I just bought a 3.0 KMW. See ya.
Here's my sensor plug. I traded 10 Hot Wheels for my max speeding rod technology 2.5. These are wheel weights I took from my mom's Corolla.